Hi, Benji.
Hey, how's it going?
Yeah, good.
Yeah, I didn't even have my microphone plugged in, USB microphone, so had to find the relevant cable and the relevant port. And sorry for the delay.
Yeah, but the client controlled nullability is really something I'm looking forward.
Yeah, I think that's a particularly interesting one.
Yeah, because for things I don't know if you guys in your project do schema stitching, but if you do something like that, it's really great because now you can batch things and don't have to worry about these null erasures. So
interesting. Yeah, I hadn't considered that.
it's I think for Apollo is also one of the will be also very helpful to manage these things, because suddenly the gateway can batch things together and just say, okay, this root field is nullable. So if a merged query then has a fault, just this one thing is deleted. So yeah. At the moment, you have to essentially have something special in there or do request batching or something like this.
Very neat.
Yeah.
I just filed a bunch of I've created a bunch of GitHub projects to put the issues, the action items from the last few meetings in. And I was like, I should go through and file some of those. And then I realized what the time was. I was like, oh, best join the call. Otherwise, I know what will happen. I'll start doing that. And in half an hour's time, I'll be like, oh, whoops, I forgot to join the call. Oh, well.
Last week, I only joined, I think the call was already half an hour in progress.
Mm-hmm.
And it was one of the best calls for a long time last.
Yeah, it was good.
Yeah, so much topics in there. I found it really intriguing.
Me and Ivan have been writing a talk for the Apollo Summit, and we about the GraphQL spec and the various contributors and stuff. And yeah, one of the themes is effectively like, look at how the number of contributors has changed. And like, it took a while, like when we set up the GraphQL Foundation, for us to start like, really making progress.
Yeah.
Initially it was like, it's pretty much Lee. Lee was doing everything, and then there was a few like typo fixes or whatever from the community, but like no like major features. But as time has come on, and the working groups been meeting and stuff, like the advances that we've made is much better, and it just seems to be getting better and better, which is great. Like it's snowballing in a good way.
Yeah, you can see it's really becoming mainstream in a good way. No? It's a lot more people using it.
Absolutely. Right, I'm gonna do some audio stuff for a moment, so I won't be able to hear you for like 15 seconds.
How's everybody doing?
Great, thanks.
Great.
Not too bad. I'm making toast. Sorry, I'm going to be muted for a second.
Now I want to make toast.
Hey, everyone.
Is that a late breakfast, Alex? Yeah.
Yeah. A little late on the day.
All right. Sounds good.
Hey, folks.
Hello.
How's it going?
We're not doing as well as Alex. He's making toast apparently. So.
Yeah, that sounds great.
Yeah, I know it does.
Toast.
Now I'm hungry. Yeah.
I'll be with y'all in a second. Sorry.
So yeah, I've just finished some pizza over here, so it's all
Ah,
going well here
that's-
too.
I think given the option between pizza and toast, I think pizza does win. Yes.
Depends on the quality.
why
of it.
aren't
Fully
these
agree.
meetings-
Bad pizza
why
is
aren't these
below
meetings
decent
catered?
toast.
True.
As per usual, we have lots of hot PRs on the agenda. I'm going through all of them right now.
One other thing I noticed wasn't on the agenda. It's just, I did notice the PR has been sitting there for a while. It's the draft PR about the guidelines for speaking on behalf of the project. I don't know if
Yeah.
that's something we wanted to cover, but
We definitely can.
I had no issues with it. I think it looks good, but I just noticed it's been sitting there for a little while. So
I'll add it to the agenda and do a hot take through it. Oh, Benji, your world has gone black.
Green screen.
Talking to you today from the depths of space.
But the green is shining through your headphones.
Yeah. So when I was testing it, I didn't have headphones on. So there we go.
Yeah, it's something COVID brought to all IT people is that everybody now has a green screen at home.
yeah, that's
Yeah.
true.
All right, I added that one in. Let's see. Does everybody have their name up on the agenda? Did we miss anybody?
I think so.
All right. Let's see. How many names do I have on the list? How many people do I have here? Pretty dang close. Let's get started. Hey everybody.
We
Happy morning,
we still
happy
need the
evening.
note stock.
Jeez. I gotta like, I'm gonna set a reminder to myself for like a half hour before this meeting starts to do that. Or like, does Google have a concept of macros? Can I like set up a macro to do this? Because at this point, I know I have like muscle memory for
You should
Connected to
great
the
words.
yeah,
do,
connected
do
to
it
the
when
Zoom
you
call
create.
starting. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yep. Okay, let me do that real quick. No. All right, I'm gonna paste that link here for now, but I'm gonna put it in the agenda too. Alrighty, with that done, and without any pull requests to merge at the moment, I think we're ready to get started. So hello, everyone. Happy whatever time it is in your neck of the woods. Welcome to yet another edition of the GraphQL Working Group meeting. Happy to see all your faces. As per usual, we always kick off with a reminder that by being here, we all agree to membership agreement, participation guidelines, and code of conduct. There's links in the agenda as per usual in case you want a reminder on any of those. Hopefully not controversial. And let's go through and just do a quick names to face introduction. We will use the order as it's listed in the agenda doc, since everyone sees a slightly different order in the Zoom participants list. And so on the top of that list is myself. So hello, everyone. My name is Lee, and I help run these meetings.
Next is
Sorry.
me.
Hello. Sorry. Hello, everyone.
Yeah.
My name is Benji, and I'm taking notes, hence my delay in noticing myself. And yeah, I work on the GraphQL projects.
Yeah, hi, I'm Michael Stipe. I'm with Chili Cream, and we are working on the GraphQL.net implementation called Hot Chocolate.
Hey, I'm Alex. I'm with Yelp. We're currently working on the client-controlled nullability RFC.
Hi, I'm Matt at Facebook. Work on client-side GraphQL.
Hi, I'm Hugh at Apollo. I work on some of Apollo's open source libraries like Apollo Client, Apollo Server, etc.
Hey, I'm Morris Circuit, IBM on a GraphQL proxy engine.
Hey, I'm Jordan. I also work at Facebook. I work on Relay.
Hi, my name is Ivan, and I'm from Apollo, and I work on GraphQL.js and some Apollo projects.
I'm Steven. I do GraphQL infra at Netflix.
Hello, my name is Brian. I work at Apollo. I work on Apollo client stuff.
Everyone, I'm Robert from AWS.
Hey, John, we're doing quick introductions. If you want to introduce yourself.
Adrian is recently joined the Amplify team here at AWS. He's shadowing me for today.
Nice.
Adrian, I don't know if your mic's working.
I think it is now.
Yeah, we can hear you.
Cool.
And I saw your pull request go up to add your name, but I think there's a little agreement to the guidelines piece that's missing. But hopefully once that's done, I'll merge you post hoc. And glad you're here. Okay. Seems like we might not have to do much for volunteers for note taking, because I see both Stephen and Benji penciled themselves in the agenda. Thank you both for doing that. Always humongously appreciated. And I see there's already lots of action happening in there. But just a reminder, as Stephen or Benji engages in discussion, if anybody else on the call wants to jump into those notes and help pick up where they left off, that would be greatly appreciated. All right, let's take a look at what we have on the plate for today. We will take a look over action items if we, in fact, filed any. There is a good note that we have that open PR for a while now about guidelines for speech. We can take a quick look at that and see what we want to do next. I want to talk a little bit about introducing the Tsc Elections process, which we are just now at the very beginning edge of, which is very exciting. And then our one primary technical topic for the day is client controlled nullability, which we can then spend as much time as we want to on that, which is very exciting. anything else that we want to talk about that's not on the agenda today? Okie dokie. Let's take a look at these links for action items. I did not open new ones. Benji, I'm not sure if you did in the last couple rounds.
I filed one from June, literally like 5 minutes ago. Yeah, so basically I was just looking through and we haven't filed any since just before June. So we're a little bit behind on filing the action items. I'm gonna, like, since it looks like we're gonna have a short meeting today, I'm probably gonna spend the rest of the time that would have been spent at the working group just catching up and filing all of those. So we may end up with quite a few to sort through, and I'm afraid I will probably file ones that we've already dealt with. But you know, if you're tagged on one of those and it's already been dealt with, just reply and we'll close it at the next working group.
I'm happy to stick around too, so maybe we can do that live together. That way, if there's anything that's, we can do a gut check if any are open and closed.
That'd be fantastic.
Cool. Well, maybe we can take a look at the few that are here. I think we have opening PRs for client level nullability. That very much happened. Excellent work. There's a bunch of PRs that have been opened on the spec, on the implementation. We even have a document capturing all the information. Fantastic work. I'm going to close this.
Cool. If I have like future updates on the work, I've been dumping it updates for the work and that, should I put them somewhere else or?
You feel free to open new ones, or, you know, it's better to have your like primary spec PR as the source of truth.
Okay.
So if you want to use that as kind of a hub, if you want to link out to the other PRs, that's a good place to do that. Or you could also keep the doc that you would just merged into the working group repo. That could be another useful source of truth. But if you want like an issue that you can kind of keep a thread going, the spec PRs kind of historically been a place where we do that.
Okay, cool. Yeah, I'll do it there. Thanks.
And that was the one that was ready for review. The one that you just opened was from a while back. And this one, maybe we'll look at this a little bit later. This is about clarity on the Unicode spec, which technically is sitting in an approved state. It has not been merged yet. It was not part of the last spec cut. So we do still have time to revisit details if there's still a lack of clarity. So I guess that one's opened on me. I'll take a look at that sometime soon. All right. Next up is guidelines for speech. So we opened this a number of months ago, back in June, as a result of some sort of craziness. So, you know, this is not an uncommon thing to see open source projects do. They stick a BLM or Palestine or Tibet or like some sort of like political moniker on the top of their README file or something else. I think we realized that those can be not always like broadly supported or considered good. And so we want to have some consistency around how we do that across all the projects within GraphQL. So we don't have some projects within the ownership of the GraphQL technical project doing this in a slightly different way than others. That was sort of the impetus and the context behind why this was written up. It's written up as part of the TSC document because who is accountable for these things? It is actually collectively us as a working group, but like in terms of who has an actual like voting say on it, it's the TSC. Of course, generally we want to operate in a consensus with all the folks who join these calls, but that's why it's here. You know, the other place where it could have ended up is the GraphQL Foundation board. Generally, what we try to do is keep a firewall between the foundation board and the technical projects. So the foundation board doesn't really get a say in how the technical projects operate themselves. They just get a say in how financial resources get allocated. And so that's the reason why this is here. It's been a little bit since this went up. It does have some approves from some folks here, but do you all want to take a minute just to read what's there? There was, I think the two things that are worth looking at are the change itself, and then Jay had a thoughtful comment here, which I think is the primary reason why we didn't directly merge it. Maybe I'll give everyone a couple minutes to read through that, and then we can see if anyone is against merging it as is or wants to see any follow-up.
Sorry if this was covered already, but what is the process for engaging this? So let's say somebody has one of these concerns, they want to submit it to TSC. Do they attend a foundation meeting?
They probably raise it as an issue, and we could either asynchronously resolve it in that issue, or we'd bring it to this meeting to discuss if it wasn't straightforward. And that would, yeah, and then that would give us an opportunity to sort of look at, you know, what's sort of the appropriate, like either we decide that, hey, guidelines want to push this to like this is your personal take, and so you should put it on your personal space, or we broadly agree with the take and we want to put it on the project, and then we can advise where. So if it, you know, came from one specific direction, like, so like the specific context behind this one was some Palestine related political speech that came via the graphical project. Imagine a scenario in which we as a group decided that that Palestinian political opinion was one that we broadly all wanted to have the GraphQL technical project advocate for. Then we would look at, is the graphical project specifically the right way to do that, or should we put it on graphql.org, or like, then we could kind of strategize exactly how we wanted to get a message out that we all agreed with. My intuition is broadly, we would probably not do most of those things, with maybe an exception of net neutrality or something that's sort of like kind of tightly tied to things that the GraphQL technical project would principally care about. That's my kind of personal take on it, but that's kind of the mechanics that I anticipate behind this.
Yeah, I agree with you, and I think we discussed this in the TSC a while ago, if I'm not mistaken, and I think we have little to gain and much to lose by getting into some of these really hot topic issues, especially because they can change so rapidly, right? But I guess my question was more around the process. So it sounds, let me just summarize and make sure I understand what you're envisioning for the process. Somebody with one of these concerns would open an issue. You would call an async vote from the TSC directly on the issue. If it can't be resolved that way, we'll cover it in the next TSC group meeting. Is that right?
Yep.
Okay, cool. That sounds totally reasonable.
Yeah, probably based on how straightforward it is and how urgent it is. So if it's like both straightforward and urgent, then we would try to resolve it async. If it's straightforward but not urgent, then we would take it to a meeting to discuss it, maybe, unless we just happen to get enough energy on the thread. If it's neither straightforward nor urgent, then clearly we would bring it here. And even if it's urgent but like not straightforward, then I don't know, maybe create some noise around it and like try to do a one-off meeting. But that's like probably going to be a rare case. And generally, this is like a little bit of an aside. We'll get to this when I talk about TSC in the next agenda item. But there's like why this is a TSC thing rather than a working group thing is purely just a matter of like we use the word vote and therefore you have to say who gets to vote, and the TSC are the set of folks here who have a voting power. But like generally we want to avoid a situation where the TSC members as like a subset of the folks who come to these working group meetings have a differing opinion from the collective. Like generally we want to have a case where we roll with consensus. So I would usually favor bringing these kinds of things to a meeting. That way we can have plenty of weigh in.
Yeah, makes sense. Yeah, I'm definitely okay with this change. But I do like Benji's suggestion for the wording, though. I think that's great.
Lee, after this call, if you can go through with me the notes that I've taken on this and just make sure that I'm quoting things correctly, because I imagine this is actually notes that may well be referenced quite, precisely. I want to make sure that I've not messed it up.
Yes,
I'm happy to do that. I did just add Benji's suggested change. I agree, that's a good one. Just clarifies what's there. I think probably the open question, the reason why I didn't just kind of merge this as is, even though there were some approvals, is there's a couple open questions here. One is, and this is, I think, more a matter of tone rather than an actual like policy change, gets to Jay's comment here, which is, and I think like my intuition is probably most of the people here would support Jay's pitch, that if we want the GraphQL technical project to remain generally politically neutral, then maybe we want to word this in a way that like kind of makes that explicit, or we kind of say like, we don't anticipate doing these. I kind of intentionally framed it as just like a mechanics only, without an opinion. It's like we only allow this with TSC vote, but like if the TSC happens to broadly share the opinion that Jay is framing here, then like that's the opinion that's going to apply, rather than applying that opinion in like the TSC rule stock. Because I don't know, there could be a future where the TSC disagrees with that. So, but I get the take that it might not come across as this being an opinion that many folks here might agree with. If you read that as is, it sounds like maybe an invitation to submit recommendations to add political speech. And I don't think that's what we're intending here. But anyway, I'm curious if anyone has an opinion on that, if it sounds good as is, or if we should alter it in some way to add the like politically neutral opinion, or if that would be too strong.
My take on it is that if it becomes a problem where we start seeing like many people, like it's oh, this is something we need to vote on every month because somebody's bringing like a new political opinion and asking the TSC to like deal with it, then yes, we probably would. But this, given that we want this to be as long-lived a like policy, there are a myriad of future worlds where who knows like what situation the like GraphQL spec would find itself in. And it's like, I think starting from a place of seeming neutrality offers like the easiest paths, even if the current like situation is, and I'm fairly certain that there is nothing like immediately obvious that besides maybe net neutrality, but even that I'm unclear that like people would be able to form a consensus around right now.
Yeah, I generally share that. I intentionally left it mechanics only for now because I know this is a little bit of a lightning rod thing. I also kind of want to avoid making too tall of a lightning rod in the scenario where it's like, even though we're not really saying anything other than that we kind of only want to use our collective voice for cases that are kind of tightly tied to the GraphQL community or project directly. Like, do we even want to go that far, or is it a thing that we will frame that opinion if we share it at a case when we actually have something that we want to weigh in on?
I guess there is like a future where there's something political that threatens like the nature of the GraphQL Foundation being able to like make progress and make changes.
Yeah.
And that
I think
would be
that's
like,
the primary reason why we wouldn't, like, an alternative to this change would be one where we just blanket ban, where we don't even say TSC vote. We just say like the project doesn't do this, and if you want to do this, you do it in your own space. Like, that would be an alternative. But yeah, I wouldn't want to rule out, I don't know, maybe someone's gonna change the structure of how open source works, or there'll be some like major legal battle between some major tech giants that all of a sudden make the MIT license mean something different, and it would be kind of terrifying, and we might want to have an opinion in that. I can conceptualize some world where we actually would be really incentivized as a group to weigh in, but that's kind of the reason why the mechanic is set up.
If that did happen, the TSC would be able to change this, right?
True.
That's what I was going to throw out there. It's like, if it's a contrived scenario, then can we, write for now and then just plan that, there are some scenarios where we might change this guidance if it came up.
yes, but the question is, anytime you write into like essentially a constitution or founding doc or like terms of agreement, the process, do you want to add the activation energy to first change those terms to then be able to act?
Yeah, that's kind of what I worry about. It's like you say you don't do it until we do. It's like, meaningfully, that is exactly the same thing, right? Like, meaningfully, that just means, should a scenario occur where we want to weigh in on something political, we would vote on it. And it's like, either it's about changing the rules about not doing that to allow this one case, or it's about like bringing it up and knowing that we would vote on that to then support that case. So I think like the mechanic is still the same. My sense is that the major difference is like, do we want to formally define a principle that we write down that says the GraphQL technical project remains politically neutral unless such a political topic directly affects the project or its immediate community's ability to function normally? And it's like, do we want to explicitly state that, or is it even like that? The trade-off there is like, one, that gives us a long-lived thing to point to and say, this is how we like to think about this. The con is that itself could be a political rod or misinterpreted. And so I wonder if it's like better left as like a shared opinion rather than something to write down. Anyway, that was my last sort of trepidation around this.
It's the only thing about shared opinion is that, like a year from now and TSC membership changes, the context right now, will be lost unless, there's still a link to like this GitHub comment or something.
Let's see. I want to make sure that we move past this. So here's what I'll do. I will raise up like an addendum to this that adds that principle, and we can just take like an offline weigh in on it, on the issue. That'll be good action. I don't think we're in a huge rush to like merging this or not merging this doesn't meaningfully change it. I think we're basically operating in this model now. But getting it right before we merge it seems worth doing. So let's do that. But I'm glad we took a look at this. That very helpful, clarifying discussion. And now we know where to go next. So good suggestion. Okay, let's move on. Next topic, Tsc elections. This is exciting. So I wrote up a whole big write-up in that Dsc Elections issue that if you haven't taken a look at that, please feel free to do that. I'll give you the TLDR. So the high level is the technical steering committee is a set of folks who many of which regularly attend these meetings, some of which only semi-attend these meetings. But everybody on this list has some sort of historical tie, or everybody who's the current Tsc seat member has a historical tie to the GraphQL project in some important way. The Tsc lets us have anything that needs formal votes. That basically that's the primary value that having a Tsc offers. It also gives us a firm set of people that we can give admin rights to things. So Tsc members have maintenance control over all of GitHub and things like that. It basically means that I don't become a single point of failure. That's kind of the other major value prop. So we set this up last November. The way that this worked is I basically got to pick everybody because before that I was sort of the solo BDFL, and now we actually have a Tsc, which is great. As we did that, we wanted to set up a structure that would be long-lived. And the idea would be that we'd have 2-year terms that would be staggered, such that at the end of every year, half the Tsc members would be, their term would end and there would be an election process to replace those seats. And then the next year would be the opposite set of seats. And in order to set that up, I made a digital coin flipper and decided who would get what. And then the Tsc doc, there's actually a link to that code. So you know that I didn't just arbitrarily decide that myself. And so what that means at the end of the year, 5 folks, 3 of which are here today, Benji, Yvonne, and Matt, but in addition to that, Brielle and James, terms will end. There's no rule about maximum number of terms. You can just kind of reassign ourselves forever if we want, but it also gives us an opportunity to cycle new people in. And the process for this is first we collect nominations. So we have a Google form up. There's a link in the agenda. There's also a link in that issue. I also tweeted this out, but I suspect the vast majority of people who are actually be interested in contributing in this way are probably the set of folks who regularly join these calls. And so if you are interested, please fill out that form. At the end of the month, we will close the nominations, and the remaining 5 Tsc members plus myself will do a vote. We'll do the Conquer Set model, which is sort of the ranked choice style vote. And then at the end of the year, we'll know who those 5 folks will be. Some seats may stay the same. Some seats may take new faces. And that's what's happening there. So that's a high level overview. No immediate action here other than if you're interested, please fill out the form. But I wanted to just kind of get it on the agenda here. 1, to make sure everyone is aware, but 2, in case anybody had any questions that I could answer them. And if there are no questions, that means that I just did an excellent job describing everything that was going on. Yay me.
There's a lot of documentation around it, and I think it's all really good. Actually, it's very thorough.
Thanks. I'll give a major hat tip to Brian Warner, who helped craft that. As I think actually ours is probably like the newest version of this, but Brian is the PM for a couple other foundations as well, and sort of learned lessons from what worked and didn't work at those places and helping us craft this one.
The only thing that might be less explicit, but I'm pretty sure I know the answer, is that I believe even people already who are current Tsc members who are up for re-election must also submit their own nominations.
Yes,
or have somebody else nominate them.
We actually took out self-nomination, or sorry, only self-nomination. So if you can't nominate somebody else, you can go bug them if you think that they should do this and have them do it. But I actually asked Brian whether we wanted to have a form that let you nominate somebody else, and he said that he's seen that play out poorly. I don't remember the exact reasons, but I can imagine, if they didn't submit the form themselves, then like that's not really a great sign that they would be interested. And if they ended up getting voted in, then you don't have an engaged person. So, but yes, yeah. If you are a current seat member and you want to just gracefully yield your seat, then feel free to ignore the form. If you do want to be considered for the next term, then yeah, please fill the form out again.
I had someone reach out to me and ask like what sort of involved as being part of the TSC, which I obviously did the best I could to answer. But I was wondering if, one of the questions was specifically like, what are the time commitments and other such things? And I pointed them to your helpful list of like, as a minimum, be available to vote, and whatever there. There's not really concrete time commitments, really, is there? Like it's best if you can attend the working group meetings. You need to be able to do the voting, but that's it, really, right? Like,
right. We do have a guideline in the TSC doc that describes how voting works, and I'm actually a little nervous about whether we will be required to enforce it or not, because I think some of the folks who are not up for election this time around and therefore will be voting members are folks that either can't or don't regularly attend this meeting, and therefore by the rules their voting power may be revoked. I might decree that we make that a little soft this time around, just so that we do actually have more people than just like 2 or 3 that are voting. So it's not just like me handpicking everybody again. That would kind of defeat the purpose. But yeah, the idea is that we ideally want to have folks who are semi-regularly engaged. Like you're not required to attend every meeting, but attending a majority will retain your voting rights. That's the minimum. And so I guess what's that minimum? A couple hours a month. But ideally, like doing the voting is one, but the other piece is removing myself as a single point of failure. So if, picking up some of the admin responsibilities and helping make sure that as spec PRs are going up and around, that we kind of keep on top of them. And hopefully that's something that's like it's not limited to a TSC member, but if something is falling behind, then I will probably look to the TSC to ask for help before I look to this whole group to ask for help. So sort of volunteering is a way to say that you're kind of excited to have that kind of impact on the project. I don't know what to say about a time commitment. I think you can easily make it be a big thing and spend, like 20 plus hours a month, but I suspect that it's probably more like 2 to 5. I pulled those numbers out of nowhere, so I don't know how accurate that is.
Thanks, Lee. I'm going to have to watch this back on the replay because annoyingly my video cut, my Zoom crashed. But there we go.
Thanks. Oh no,
that's why we have video.
I will say, as an outsider, not part of the TSC, just keeping an eye on the working group meetings and all that fun stuff over time, that it's really great to see TSC members attend this meeting. It really puts out a good signal that the people that are helping steer the direction of the GraphQL spec overall are taking the time out of their busy schedules to attend these meetings because they care. I know it's not enforced, but it's awesome that you're calling that out as being encouraged.
Definitely encouraged. And it's a little bit of, to be honest, a little bit of a delicate line to walk, because another approach here could have been to not really advertise this much, and except for this group. Like we meet here and I say, hey, which among this crew would like to be a TSC member? That runs the risk of creating kind of an insular community. And a number of the TSC members who don't regularly attend, it's unfortunate, I'd like for them to attend, but they do offer a perspective that's different than the set of folks who are regularly here. So like one of the things that I'm kind of constantly thinking about is how do we make sure that the set of folks who come to this meeting is constantly diversified and we get new faces in on the regular, which I think we do. We do get new faces. There's definitely like a core set of folks, which is excellent. But I would love for that to happen even more. I think that would be a sign of a healthy community. And so if we do have some TSC members who take interest and are helpful active members who don't show up via this group, but show up somewhere else, but then are encouraged to show up here, that will be another tool that we can use to keep this group diversified. So that's something I have on my mind, but yeah, I do want to make sure that we encourage those folks to join here. There was also, just a little more context on the initial framing of the TSC. Brian actually suggested having a separate monthly TSC call that was purely the TSC members. I pushed back against that. I said, one of the things I don't want to do is create a firewall between things that the TSC has up for discussion versus things that the rest of the working group has up for discussion. And so like the first few minutes of this meeting by the rules is the TSC meeting, and we just kind of front load the agenda. And then that keeps us from falling down that path. But Alex, I see your hand. What's up?
In addition to the voting itself, you'd also be expected to like read and review the proposals that are up for vote, right? Like, what's the volume of that look like? How often are you voting?
It basically boils down to just like, if you sit through the majority of these meetings, then you accumulate that, because the idea with any of these major changes is that we get broad consensus and not just TSC consensus. So if we do want to take a vote on whether to move something forward, then we can lean on the TSC. In practice, we actually don't usually do that. In practice, we look for a consensus among the people who are on a call. And if there's any significant dissent, then we wait. And it's part of the reason why things take a while, but it's better to have broad consensus to move things forward than it is to like have divergence and have to have a TSC take a majority vote, because presumably if there's disagreement, then the broader community at large would have to use this stuff, might also be split. And like, that's not something that we want to do. So certainly I think like keeping abreast of what's going on in the technical project is another reasonable sort of like minimum requirement, and attending here will get you all of that, but not the only way to do it. You can also just kind of read the PRs as they come up.
Gotcha. Cool. Thanks.
But yeah, but generally the changes that are meaningful basically always get discussed in this meeting. So if you don't pay attention to GitHub at all and just show up to these meetings, you'll get everything. Which is what I do more than I probably should. Any other questions about the TSC process? Cool. That was actually really helpful questions. So thank you. Okay, with that, Alex, I'll hand it to you. Tell us what's up with client controlled nullability.
Yeah, so the human readable written proposal 1-page doc thing was merged earlier, so that's in the working group repo. There are PRs up for the spec changes and also a GraphQL.js implementation. Looking for reviews on both those. I got questions about that later. And then Young, who used to be at Netflix at Square now, he's been helping us do an implementation or an integration with the Guild's code generator. So he's been working on that. So we should have that soon. Yeah, as far as reviews, are there any people it's like essential to get reviews from? Is like the volume of reviews important? If I go and like ask a bunch of people to review it, is that helpful?
I think that is helpful. I think you probably want, and actually this might be something that's worth including on that main issue. I see you linked out to like some Google Docs, but like having something where you can keep a running list of open questions and their state. That way, as someone who's reviewing this kind of knows what you have up that you consider like near complete, and what you have up that you know that there are already sort of like open discussion threads around. So like I know the last time this came through, we talked about when you have when the type on the field in the schema is more complicated than just whether it's null or not null, but it's like null, non-null of a list of non-nulls. It's like, is there a way that you can reach into that list and affect the nullability of the items within that as well? Do we want to explicitly say that we definitely don't want to do that? Like, what would the trade-offs of that be? So like, that's one case. And then the other is the set of things where there are unknowns, where implementations will help, and making sure that we get reviews on those particularly. I think the code review one, or sorry, the code generator one is going to be very interesting to see, because I know that was a concern, is will this make code generation significantly more complicated? And so like having a prototype of that up and running, I think is going to be very impactful. I don't know if has anyone from Relay taken a close look at this? I know y'all had a directives-based version of this at some point. Is that right? But
Yeah,
I'm
we
curious
have
to know
a
if Relay's code generator would be affected.
Yeah, I haven't had a chance to look at the implementations that are up so far, but definitely our code generation does already handle the sort of similar behaviors, so I don't anticipate it'll be overly complicated for us.
The one thing for Relay is whether this for Relay means the exact same as like what Relay already has, the like at required, or whether this in which case for Relay, this means the server will never see these query level nullability things, because it'll get compiled away and be like a client only consideration, or whether it's like something special that Relay continues to pass to the server that then gets like fed back.
Yeah, I suppose that would be Relay's choice as to how much of that to do locally versus how much to pass through. But
yeah, our intention or our expectation is that we are going to continue to present the facade that these are scoped to the fragment, and that you may have multiple different fragments with different notions of their like nullability, which requires us to at least never send conflicting information to the server. So we could, in theory, if all fragments had the same nullability, decide to send that to the server. But my guess is that's a small enough case that we wouldn't bother to do it.
I'm thinking of, so I know Relay for a long time has had non-null or required or some version of that as either an experiment or something that's shipped. I don't know if there was the opposite, just because there isn't a way to do that client side. Like if there is a field, and maybe this is irrelevant because Facebook's internal server doesn't have that many examples of non-nulls, but having something that could error and will bubble because it's non-null, to be able to say, no, actually, I want to catch the error at this place and nulling it here is okay. That's something that you can't do client side, right? But this proposal would then allow you to do that if you pass it through to the server.
And I think a great use case for this, or what I'm looking at, is also schema stitching, where you then can, when you aggregate the queries to a downstream service, you essentially can merge multiple requests into one query, and then make the root fields of this merged query nullable, so that you don't lose information if one of the fields has an error.
That's a cool idea.
Back when we were first working on this, we did get an integration. We integrated into Apollo's command line tool, which relies on GraphQL.js. And we didn't test it very hard, but CodeGen, like it seemed to generate what we wanted pretty much out of the box. We want to make sure things like combining the required, the exclamation point and skip doesn't do anything wacky, because I don't know, that interaction could be nonsensical. But otherwise, I think we're in a good position. I think it's more the smart clients, especially the ones that rely on their caches a lot, are going to have to do some work to work around some of this stuff.
Yeah, it would be great to see us list out what are all the things that are potential questions. And then even if they, once you think about them hard, are easily resolved, like great, then we just end up building an FAQ kind of block. Because presumably people will have similar kind of questions. So like the one that you just framed, should skip and include interact with this in some weird way. My intuition is that they do, even though they are in a similar domain, it's like the thing is or isn't there. It's like the way in which they do that is different enough that they probably shouldn't interact. But I'd love to know that that's confirmed, you know, see some test cases that prove that, and then have an FAQ that states it.
Yeah, for sure. Cool.
Any other than the going into lists, is there anything else that was like a major open question?
See, I can pull up that doc real quick.
One other thing I'll just raise from the relay side is, of course, we have 3 flavors of this. We have one which does the behavior defined in the spec or in the proposal, and one which just does that same thing, but also logs it as like, oh, there's something suspicious is going on here, someone should follow up, and one which actively throws. We anticipate that we're going to continue to use a directive for the behaviors that don't match this proposal. But just one piece of context is that like usage within our app is like 90-something% the throw behavior. I don't think it's worth reconsidering this. Like this feels like a much better fit for something that will go into the spec. But it's just worth calling out that there is that like deviation between how we've seen it adopted within our code base and like what we're actually building here.
Can you say more about the throw behavior? Like what's the difference between throw behavior and what's spec here? So throw behavior makes sense really mostly in React, where we have this concept of error boundaries. So throws at read time. So when you go to render a component that reads out a required field, it will throw and it will blow up that component up to its parent error boundary. So it's like idiomatically makes sense in a React world, but I don't think it's generally applicable like outside of React. Matt?
So Alex, I actually had somewhat similar questions, and I read the spec PR, the most recent spec PR. Alex, I think can basically, I think that this could compose with relays behavior, because there is like when you, if name is in fact null, it becomes an error in the like errors path, in which case a like relay style at required that says, oh, treat the parent as null, when it hits that null can, you know, bubble up. It can say, oh, bubble that up. When it hits the, if it's at required throw, then it can say, oh, is there an error path on this one? That's like, that means that there's an error here. So I actually think because we're including fails from this, when the server encounters a failure, there is an error path and an error message in the errors part of the response. It feels actually fairly similar to throw.
Yeah, I guess mostly it's just on the syntactic basis, right? Like we're not going to be able to make, we're not like 90% of the instances of required in our code base are not going to be able to migrate to this new syntax. Which is, I don't necessarily know it's a problem, but it's just worth considering.
Sure.
I wonder if that's like, if that's the 90%, would you flip it? Would you say like, if you see an exclamation point on a field, you interpret that as don't render the component and throw it to an error boundary, unless there's some directive that says just like, you know, bubble this up to the, I don't even know what you would call that, but if that's 90% case, flip it around, you know.
My inclination would be not to, because it would disagree with the spec. So if people went to go like look at, hey, I see the syntax in my code, let me look at GraphQL spec to understand what this thing does, it would be preferable that it matches.
Yeah.
Yeah, I linked the doc we were talking about in the Zoom chat. The other things here are being able to customize behavior like what Relay's doing. I don't think we have a very good upgrade path for that right now. Like I think the upgrade path for being able to mark like list items required is doable. It's pretty I mean, not straightforward, but it's doable. I don't know what an upgrade path for more customization would look like. And then the other thing in here I have is caching. It's outside the scope of this proposal because it's all going to be client side, but I like to have, be able to give people some idea of how that's going to work.
Yeah, my sense is that guidance for normalized caches will probably do what Relay already does, which is anything that enforces a non-null just becomes a client-side cache read behavior rather than a server-side fetching behavior. That way, if you have one thing that requires the value and one thing that does not, you can normalize it and have the same. But I don't know, maybe there's alternatives.
I think the most common alternative, the alternative at least that my client stuff would have to do is anytime there is errors, just like nothing gets written to the cache, like any request that it has any amount of invalidity, we don't even attempt to put anything into the cache, which is a reasonable behavior if a little bit heavy-handed.
Yeah, with the number of different kinds of errors, it could get complicated really fast if you're doing, custom things for each one. Does that make sense?
Yeah, that's not crazy. I can see it. Would you probably still like, if it's I guess you could decide whether or not you wanted to pass a partial result through to be used by a component or UI or whatever is going to use the data, but skipping cache for something that is not complete seems smart. Otherwise,
just as a
that might not make sense to read back out.
Note, at least at Facebook, our native handlers just like throw on error anytime there's an error at all in the request. We do not give the client the ability to like access that data, even if there is a partial response. So like that works at Facebook scale. So not that that's like what you should be doing. I don't know if that's the correct, like the best behavior, but it works.
It's not unreasonable. And I mean, that is essentially a client side way to say that you interpret this as a throw variant, right? Because like the throw variant thing is very interesting to me because I think like, is that purely about how a client interprets a result? Or is this actually like, would our spec text change in some way if we decided that this is a throw variant version of client-side nullability instead of what we have now? I could maybe see one where it's like, if you have a field that's, say we have a throw style rather than what we have now, maybe it just like blows up the entire query. You get 0 data back if you have something marked ! that comes back null. Or you explicitly have to have a question mark operator somewhere higher up. So it's kind of like a Java or JavaScript style try catch or throw catch kind of mechanic. But if it's purely a client side mechanic, like that idea of if the errors field has anything in it, then just throw the whole thing out. Like that's a throw variant, right?
Yeah, I think like we thought a little bit about like, what if you did have, instead of using a question mark for saying we allow this to be nullable, or like basically you have syntax similar to like Rust or even TypeScript, where you have the exclamation mark is like, this is an assert, and the question mark is like, this is nullable. And then you can like use those together. But I do think that the throw variant doesn't make sense on the server as much because it's so destructive. It's destructive enough on the client, and it's only mitigated by the fact that this is like that we have these error boundaries constructs in React. but it feels exceptionally heavy-handed in the response to me.
That maps well to other conversations I've had around this. One interesting context, we're exploring a particular install of GraphQL at Robinhood, and the primary problem that's been brought up right now is actually the error boundaries thing. So it's not even about, hey, this could be null on the server and I want to enforce that I have data on the client. It's what happens if something blows up and a part of the response is gone. I want the ability to say, that's okay, like, please stop blowing things up at this point. And it's okay if that requires my client side to be required to handle the null case. And so, like, it's like the opposite of the intent for this original proposal. So I thought that was kind of interesting, but it maps well to what you were saying, Jordan, that if we had a throw variant on the server, that concern would get even more scary. What's up, Stephen?
You know, when we like before we implemented this at Netflix, we considered, you know, some different options, and one of them was it's, you know, admittedly kind of a more drastic approach, but basically on the server side, allowing to change the semantics slightly of non-null to signify that you're indicating that this thing should, like, semantically be nullable or not. And so then, you know, concretely what that means is that if it is ever returned null, there will be an error present in the errors array. And so then that allows, you know, clients that, you know, choose to just explode on errors being present to go ahead and, you know, bubble that up. But it also allows clients that choose to, you know, accept partial results to do that. But you know, the main challenge there is that kind of, you know, it's hard to make as backward compatible. It's like you'd need to, you know, make like a strict mode or something. And also, if you're going to take that approach, probably you'd want in practice to invert semantics and use like a question mark in the schema to say that, you know, most things shouldn't, you know, like aren't intended to actually have null be a significant value. And then occasionally it's a, you know, it's a maybe, and that's, you know, an intentional thing. Is that ever something we'd consider, like adding a maybe to the SDL?
Generic types.
I mean, I can see an alternate reality. I agree, we can't really do this because it would be way too breaking, but had this concept and proposal been raised long ago, like before the type system itself was really solidified, then like I'm talking like 2013, 2014, then you know, maybe it would have made sense to say everything on the server is assumed to not include null as a valid response unless explicitly described as such. I mean, the main reason why we considered it and explicitly decided not to do that, just because of the blow up problem. You get one thing down the tail that someone just assumed would always be a string, but like actually, in fact, it's string or null, and then you go ship, and then it turns out that thing blows up all the time, and it blows up the entire query, and now you've like shipped like a showstopper bug, and we thought that was like way too big of a foot gun. But if your client language had the ability to say, like, I explicitly put error boundaries in my queries, and here's where I put them, and then I think maybe that would have been a more viable reality. But I think we are where we are with the type system. Fields will be nullable unless marked non-null. I think that's probably, yeah, the idea of introducing strict mode, seeing how well strict mode went for every other language that's tried to do something like that makes me shudder. But I think the semantics that you described for the query language are the ones that we have, unless I misunderstood something, right? Where you mark something with exclamation point that should still introduce an error into the errors log. That behavior, I think, is, I don't know if it's explicitly stated. I think it's emergent. Maybe it makes sense to explicitly state it. But if right now the way the spec text reads is you take the field type off the field, and then you modify it by applying your question marks and exclamation points. And then that ends up being the type that you assume that the field is when you go do execution and value completion and all of that. And so if that's a non-null type, and then you end up with a null value, you say, hey, that's not allowed, that's an error, and that gets logged in the errors field before the rest of the behavior occurs. So I do think that behavior at least is the same. So if you do have a client that says, I stop, I don't move on if I have anything in that errors field, then like they will actually use that behavior here, rather than just like silently getting a partial response.
So that just makes me question, like, is this another like potential decision where clients might choose, like similar to what Relay would ideally want to do, to have this like throw semantic? Like, is that a place where there might be a larger population of clients who would want that behavior? Or am I misunderstanding the?
I think my intuition is that that behavior is broadly desirable. Like the fact that Facebook's native clients have the stop process if errors contains anything. The whole sort of like the whole work that has been happening around defining errors within your domain, like don't rely on errors getting bubbled through the errors. Like if there's something that could go wrong, that's part of your domain, then map it there. Like Sasha's done a ton of work in that space. All of that sort of points to the idea that like if you end up with something that's an error in the errors field, then it might not be safe to proceed. And that seems to be like a very reasonable client behavior, especially if it's easy to go back and fetch again. And so like interpreting that as client side throw, then maybe you just get that behavior for free if that's already kind of the operating model that you use, since it would put that there. But I don't know, should we reconsider something about behavior here to change that? Or is this maybe about just like giving people a recommendation on how to interpret it?
Yeah, I guess it would just be like, if I went to the spec to go understand what this syntax does, and it talks about bubbling null, and then when I use it in my client, it throws, like that would be confusing to me. And so we want to set expectation appropriately.
Is that already the case though? Because there are, like if you have a field that's non-null, that and at runtime you get a null. But I guess I see what you're saying. Like there's what we're doing in the scenario where your schema defines something as non-null, and then under the hood a null occurs, then like something has gone terribly wrong under the hood. And that generating an exception style error makes a lot of sense. Whereas the schema saying a null is completely possible here, and then you as a client saying, I understand that, but I don't want that case, then yeah, is that still exceptional in the same way?
Right, and in Relay, we have a way to describe both cases. You can say, this is, actually 3 cases, or you say like, this is not exceptional, I expect this to be happening all the time, or like, this is, it would be exceptional, it's not exceptional, and it's exceptional, but I can recover.
Yeah, interesting. Yeah, Bon.
Yeah, one thing that we can do to kind of like convey this semantic, throw semantic on a server is instead of just replacing type with non-nullable, like wrapping it in non-nullable during execution, we can change a little bit of how we do errors. So we can, inside the error that blow up with like sub3, we can include partial result. So if you specify exclamation mark, it's mean like you get error, but with partial result inside, like the thing that you blow up. And that basically the closest possible thing to throw semantic you can do on the server. It's like you can access the same field. And it actually makes sense because like from a schema design point, you're okay with it. if person specifies exclamation didn't specify exclamation mark, he will get this data anyway. And like with exclamation mark, he said I wanted to be something out of ordinary, but like without losing the data, basically.
Yeah, I wonder if I feel like that's orthogonal to the thing that I'm nervous about. It's less about if you get an error, are you then missing data? Like the client presumably would put an exclamation point somewhere to explicitly state that they're totally comfortable missing the scenario where something is null. That is interesting. Like if something ends up being nulled higher up, like do you take the tree that we would have put there and stick it somewhere else? Yeah, it's an interesting idea.
In throw semantics, as we discussed with error boundaries, it's basically like you want to like just this thing to throw. If neighborhood components like work okay, like they can execute just like with error boundary triggers. So client, I don't know about Trello client because of margin rules for validation, but simpler clients that don't do like a margin bunch of stuff, but still want to do error boundaries. It's like basically a client can like inject stuff from error, he can inject it back and like add proxy object to throw on specific field.
I wonder if a happy medium here, like it seems like the direction we're saying here is like, what if the answer is more information? And like, it is the behavior of if your errors field has anything in it, throw it all out is just like too simplistic of a behavior just because like we don't have enough information there to make any better call. But like I could see an alternative here being whether you use an exclamation point or not, like some error occurs and it starts to bubble. And that error is going to get logged in the errors field. Now, if you had a question mark somewhere, presumably that says, I want to catch that error here. I want to catch it, and then I want to like trim my response at this point. If you do that, like imagine if you're a Relay or a Facebook native client or somewhere where, you know, having an error somewhere could meaningfully blow up your whole component or blow up the whole entire request. Would we want to interpret the use of a question mark as saying like, no, actually, please don't blow up my request. Like, please give me the partial result. Like I'm putting the question mark here to signify that I understand that an error below here could happen. And I actually do want a partial result. And if so, then maybe we need the ability to say, we still flag an error in the errors array, but we mark it as error was caught, and it was caught at this point. Because right now we say where the error came from, but we don't necessarily say where the error caused a field to become null. So maybe if you explicitly use question mark, then we say this error was caught at this location. And then if you could decide if your client wants to have a behavior where it allows partial results, if you opted in with the question mark to say, all right, I'm going to go look through my errors. And as long as all of the errors listed here say that they were caught errors, then I'll proceed. But if any of them say that they weren't caught, then I will throw the whole thing out. And then that actually gives you a meaningfully different behavior. If you have a field that is nullable and a field that is nullable with a question mark on it, like in the current way the spec text is written, those are identical. The question mark does not imbue any new behavior. This would imbue new behavior, but all it really does is like adds an annotation to the error object.
Definitely interesting. Is it useful? Like, I don't know.
It just seems like additional information, right? Like,
yeah,
like, right. And maybe this is actually interesting information to include kind of completely orthogonally to this proposal, because this question comes up of hey, okay, I see that this field is null. Is that field null because it was the value itself was null, or is that field null because it caught an error and like that was happened to be the lowest nullable field and therefore like real data got dropped there? And right now you can kind of figure that out by looking at your errors array and seeing was an error thrown below that field. And if so, then likely it is the case, but like, I don't know, maybe something else happened too. But like, that's actually kind of a slightly confusing thing to do. But like, it's maybe interesting to like, this would give us a way to say client intent to catch an error, as opposed to like the schema just happened to define this as a nullable field and therefore safe to turn into null.
Yeah.
So here's something that is maybe not worth spending very much time on, but just like thought, if we had a first class error type a la list, like first class, we have this error type, would the proposal change? Would we do something different in terms of exclamations and question marks?
Can you say more about that?
Yeah, so like if there was a way for you to encode, hey, this field could be an error, or even if we said for any field, if there is an error thrown, instead of like putting this in the errors array, we give you an error object with some message at that point in the response. And then that error could, also you could have, maybe it's an error interface or whatever. You can extend the error and you can have like, oh, what's the child values that we were able to get or whatever on it. Like, but if we had that kind of first class concept that you can have some error type that like wraps other types, would like a field ending up null in the response that we didn't want to be null, would that mean that the parent is error with like more details inside rather than being null? I don't know. And basically, would it, so if we had first class errors of some form, would we radically alter how we would approach this problem? If so, is it the kind of thing that we should like really spin up something real quick to try to like throw together what would first class errors look like and decide, yes, we want to block on it or not? But I don't know if that's even worth considering.
I anticipate that having an error object appear directly in the response rather than sideloaded would meaningfully change enough things that like that alone would force a different interpretation. Like we considered that, right? Like the reason why we ended up sideloading them rather than putting them in is a naive client wants to be able to just like write, foo.bar.baz and expect to get a value. And if there's an object there, but it happens to be a different kind of object, it's an object with like an error message in it, you get into confusing potential results. And also like that then occludes your ability to have fields with particular name. Maybe you want to have message as like a field in that error object. Now you can't have a field called message because if I wrote foo.message, maybe it's the message from my schema, maybe foo errored out and now I'm getting an error message. So like that was the main reason why we decided to sideload them. But assume that we had something better than JSON and it let us sort of like have a first class object type in the payload. Then I would anticipate you kind of similarly to what we have with null, like what a client really wants is the ability to say, if I say this is a string, it's a string. It's not a string or a null. It's not a string or an error. It's a string. So when I start accessing properties of it or start doing stuff with it, I don't always have to like refine my left-right type or my maybe type before I start like doing work with it. And if I have to do that at every single point along the way, like that's very annoying. And that's actually kind of the motivation here, right? So in that mode, I would still expect us to be able to say, either you have like explicit like throw catch points or like some way for a client to say, I only care about handling errors at this particular point. And then maybe like with a first class error, you would say, you know, errors always bubble until they hit one of those things. And if you have a question mark, then you're explicitly opting in to say this is a whatever type you described it is, or it's a error type. Maybe be like an alternate way to do that. But I think so many things would change that might be tricky. But Brian, I saw your hand go up first.
Well, yeah. One thing I will say as I think about like nulls in GraphQL is that it's all very much influenced by maybe like there's like an oversized influence of JavaScript and JSON and the semantics of null in JavaScript and JSON, specifically the idea that there is a distinction between like a positive like null versus a negative undefined or missing or whatever, right? Like that $1 million mistake or whatever. I don't know how we count that as a design decision, like what the cost of it is. But so there's that. And I always wonder if like, what if instead of having just like null, we just excluded stuff from the shape if it was missing. But we don't have to go over that. But like, I think there's a similar argument to be made for errors because like, again, JavaScript has its own semantics about how errors work, and it's wildly different in all these other languages. So like, I worry about trying to add this sort of stuff to the specification. And like, how would that work for Swift? How would that work for like all these other languages which have different error semantics? Like even just in JavaScript, there's a lot of ways that a lot of different opinions that people have about how errors should be handled. So
Totally fair. Stephen, you had your hand up next.
Yeah, you know, with you know, Matt's suggestion, there's kind of two parts that I'm hearing. Is one is a little bit, you know, a little bit more structure around like different types of errors. And then the second is, you know, where do we put them? Are they in the graph versus, you know, side-loaded? And I think we could consider those separately. I mean, in theory, if you have a path in the error, a client should be able to, you know, intelligently insert them. And so, you know, a naive client can just, you know, just get the string or not. And then another client could kind of make that, you know, I mean, I guess it's basically an implicit union of every, you know, belief. In practice, I feel like the path, I just don't see it used much programmatically. Are there reasons for that? Like, is that insufficient, like something that we need to push on, or is it just, you know, just kind of the way we've done things?
Can you say that programmatic part again? No, if I totally followed them.
Yeah, well, like using the path in the client to like attach errors to where they happen in the graph, for example, you know, like tooling that uses the path. Because what it seemed to see in practice is that, you know, basically we see any errors, we explode, and then if a path is used, it's just kind of by a human debugging it. Does that make sense?
It does, yeah. Because you're right, all of the information exists to take the data field and the errors array and then use path to merge them together to insert error objects in the result, right? You use the path to do that. That's a completely doable client-side transform.
Yeah, so I guess the fact that clients don't do that is a pretty good argument that like it's not what is needed.
I would say like maybe the difference is like, if you think about the developer ergonomics of that, it's super annoying because now every single field is now like a left-right type. And so like if you're writing TypeScript or Swift or Kotlin or anything where you have like dot operators to like dig into something, having to like explicitly unpack all the way along the way is just going to be super annoying. And so like maybe actually the missing piece is an explicit concept of an error boundary, which is kind of part of what we're proposing here. And if you did have like, this part right here is question marky, or maybe this like could be prototyped with the directive to say like error boundary. And like that is the spot at which like a client will look at that, and below that say, if I've got any errors with pass below this error boundary, then I'll left-right type that thing. Like that could be quite interesting. And maybe what we're proposing here with client-side nullability is a syntactical tool that could allow us to go in there and try something like that. Like, I guess the major question we have here, which is one that we kind of often address, is should this meaningfully change server behavior, or is this about giving the client the maximum amount of information such that it can do post-processing, right? Like if you inserted error objects into the client or did this error boundary behavior on the server side, that could omit information, or that could result in a payload that would be difficult to manage by a more naive client, right? Like I got bash scripts that hit GraphQL endpoints and then use JQ to use the results. I don't want to have to do like post-processing.
Just really quick, what you're describing with the error boundary, it wouldn't have any additional server side behavior, right? It would just be information for the client.
Okay. Yeah, this is getting at like Steven's suggestion of like, hey, why is it that we don't actually see this transform? And I think we're just like missing a key piece there. And then I guess maybe the other motivation is like, do we care, right? So Facebook's native implementation says if there's any error anywhere, like throw the whole thing out. And presumably that's working okay, because if it didn't, then you would probably see a bunch of product engineers griping that their screens are busted all the time and would start begging for something like an error boundary. And the fact that they haven't maybe is an indication, at least within that particular domain, that's not needed. But that's a super interesting question. Yeah, why aren't we seeing that more? Jordan, your hand's up too. Go for it.
Just going back to this like notion of we have like throw versus bubble semantics, like it just occurred to me, and maybe this is actually kind of what you were saying, Lee, that like if we decided that client-side nullability and server-side nullability were somewhat different, you could theoretically say exclamation point is an assert, it throws, and it's caught at the parent client defined error boundary. And I think you could describe the like expected behavior of the current proposal using those primitives. So like if you just want to bubble to the parent, you would say exclamation point parent question mark on the immediate parent. But if you wanted to throw semantic on your client, then you would just omit the question mark. And then like this, I think would allow you to express something similar to what Relay wants, and also to express something simpler, which is just a simple bubble semantic. But I don't know.
Although
that'd be entirely non-destructive.
Yeah, Relay is interesting in that the error boundaries are fragments, and fragments don't exist.
Right.
So like how would Relay, like if Relay wanted the throw semantic on a fragment, like if you want to, not that this should affect it, but like Relay can treat fragments as essentially functions, whereas the GraphQL executor cannot.
Yeah, I think like Relay would continue to present this facade of fragment isolation. I guess the maybe one flaw with this idea, or one of perhaps many, is that if you say, okay, we're just going to throw at this point and it's up to you to catch it somewhere, if you neglect to catch it anywhere, then you've just like introduced a giant, Chekhov's gun on the mantle or something like that.
Yeah, that was kind of what I was trying to get at before with like how Relay might want to interpret this. Because it is like before this, there is no way for a client to describe this intent other than having some tool specific directive in place. But it doesn't seem crazy to me that a client side tool like Relay or Apollo client would say, because you have these fragment boundaries that like if you use exclamation point, then we'll treat that like a fragment defined assertion that will blow up the component that's linked to that fragment. Unless contained also within that is a question mark. So you can imagine foo bar Baz, and Baz has an exclamation part and bar has a question mark. So now you've got like, okay, Baz, there's an error, bar catches it, and all that is contained within the same fragment. Then like, great, don't blow up your fragment because your developer has told you that it's safe to catch such an error right here. I guess like our question is, how much of this kind of behavior do we want to put on the server and therefore in the spec? And how much of this is space for clients to have some additional behavior? And if so, do we have the appropriate information such that they can do that? Or are we missing something so that doing that kind of client behavior is too fiddly or like error prone or confusing?
Yeah, and I would also just be a little bit concerned about having the semantics of it in one client differ from the semantics of it in another client, where, I mean, obviously there's already this facade of fragment isolation, but like this would be going further than that to like, oh, this in one domain is, just a bubbling thing up to the parent, and in another domain is more destructive. Unless we clarify that in the spec that we, the spec says clients may opt to do something different.
Yeah.
I'd make the argument that given all the discussion about question mark being a potential error boundary, that maybe we want to preserve that separately from the exclamation mark, like not necessarily introducing them to the spec at the same time, but I could be wrong.
I think it's tough to talk about one without talking about the other, especially if the semantics of their error boundary imply something different about how if the question mark has error boundary just purely means, yeah, just go ahead and treat that field as if it was nullable, which is how the spec text is currently written, is slightly different from like, does that have a behavior on the error itself? Do we omit the error from the errors array? Do we annotate the error in the error array that it was caught? Like, is there something extra happening? Like right now, that's not part of the proposal, but I think it's interesting. Or like, taking Jordan's idea and taking it all the way up to the server. Like, if this is something that is designed to be used pairwise with an exclamation point, where an exclamation point is a fatal level throw that like, if you don't catch it, will always go all the way up to the parent, regardless of any nullable fields in the process, unless you have a question mark. And in that case, that would give it semantics much more similar to sort of traditional throw catch. If we did that, that would be more destructive. Maybe that's kind of the foot gun that, maybe that's a little too scary. But like, if we went down that path, like you couldn't have that conversation without question mark being part of it. So
I agree with that. I think that the question mark and the exclamation point need to be solved at the same time. Since Lee suggested adding the question mark when this topic was raised in the previous working group, it has made me rather like nervous. It just doesn't feel quite right. And this discussion's helped me figure out why I feel less comfortable about that. I think it can allow issues in your data model to come up that wouldn't otherwise come up. So where something might be, if there's a non-nullable assertion that would then like throw through a layer, if we were to naively apply the question mark as just effectively changing the underlying type of this, then it would potentially allow that object or allow its pair. Yeah, I don't know. I need to write it down on paper to make sense. But what I think that I'm getting at is that the question mark might be more subtle than merely changing the type and then piping this new type through the executor. It feels like it does something different. And I think that if the underlying thing would have thrown an error anyway, it probably should still throw an error. Like, I see the question mark as more of a, here is a point at which we can catch an error that we have added, rather than here is a way of allowing an error that would previously have been bubbled up to a higher level to instead stay here. It feels like potentially these are slightly different behaviors.
Yeah, that's super interesting. I'm always hesitant to have slightly different behaviors for two things that both kind of describe themselves as errors. As soon as we have like a client side flavor or like a query defined flavor of error versus a server defined flavor of error, I don't know. I can see that getting confusing, but I don't necessarily disagree. There's definitely something different here. I think probably to take this back to first principles, what we should really do is be thinking about how will people want to use this? And obviously we want as much of a diversity of opinion as possible on that, so we don't overly constrain it. But even just having this conversation now has been really helpful to like think through, oh, like the idea that 90% of cases of wanting a non-null are actually throw cases, like having this desired behavior of actually wanting to blow up some localized scope is actually very interesting. And it implies that, you know, I guess like our action item here is to like add to our list of unanswered questions. Question mark is not simply this is client defined null. It's more like this is probably somewhere in the domain of error boundary, but the semantics of that, there's some options in that space with maybe some different trade-offs, and we should guide ourselves to the one that yields the most developer value.
Yeah. There's going to be a lot to think about. Yeah.
Your point about diversity is, I think, really good, because I think it's hard for me to untangle what that 90% number means when we're in a React world where we have these error boundaries, and like, does that apply more broadly into other UI libraries and UI authoring models where you don't have that same kind of primitive?
Yeah. For me, I think it's the trade-off is between biasing towards more information or biasing towards an immediate structure that you can use. So if you're a very sophisticated client like Relay or Apollo client, you want maximal information because you're doing post-processing anyway. And if the information can give you, as you know, tons of info about what happened on the server and how to appropriately act, that's a good thing. If you're a shell script calling curl, then like you probably really don't want extra information, especially if that information is like, here's the next steps that your client should probably do with this before you start interpreting the data. You want like a final payload that is as close to the thing you want as possible. But this ends up being a trade when if the final payload is destructive, right? Like, and that's why I think this is super tough. Because if it was purely about, let's just put the error in the right spot and call it a day. But if doing that removed information, which I can see being the case, like if you said, all right, yeah, exclamation point means fatal, that's just like always going to bubble up to the parent. All of a sudden, this becomes like a giant data deletion gun where you put that there and then it just completely blows up queries. Where like if you have a client somewhere that actually really does care about a partial result, they now have to like start writing lint rules for their code base to like make sure that you require adding a question mark in if there's an exclamation point somewhere below it. If we decide to have that behavior, maybe GraphQL ends up with a validation rule that requires that. It's like you got to put it somewhere, even if the place you put it is on the parent field. Like any use of an exclamation point must also come with a question mark if it ends up with that kind of semantic. It's a viable direction, but like, I don't know, this is a tough trade. Like, I think we probably want to just start writing out like what is an what is the error boundary and what's its relationship to an exclamation point and client controlled non-nullability, and like option A, option B, option C, trade-offs, pro cons. I think that's probably our next step for something like this.
Sweet. Yeah. I'd love to get, you know, written feedback from people and get some of this in writing. It's difficult for me to mull this all over right now.
Yeah, hopefully not entirely on you, Alex. Maybe you can help facilitate and like prod people until they give you that. What's up, Ryan?
Yeah, I really like this framing in terms of like first principles, like what do developers want? And what I've seen that like my limited understanding of what developers really want with these two operators is just the ability to stop making schema changes, which are breaking. Like it's like both making a field non-nullable or non-nullable, like both of those changes are breaking changes because of the way that code generation works in like across all clients. So that's the main thing. I would like to preserve whatever happens with this like error boundary stuff.
Yeah. So you mean the value there being, rather than the server changing this and therefore cascading breaking changes, the client changing this implies that they know what they're doing, and if they fail a test related to the code generator, then like that's their fault, because if they change the client query locally, they should also change the code that consumes it.
Yeah, I just like to say, I think from our perspective, the user problem that this is solving is different. Where we have pervasive nullability everywhere, everything is null all the time. And literally the problem they want to go away is, I don't want to write 10,000 null checks. Like, you know, our code looked like one GraphQL query, half the code is null checks, and then half the code is actually business logic. And that's the problem that they want to go away. So it maybe is different in different schemas, depending on how heavily they lean into the pervasive nullability.
Yeah,
that was exactly the same motivation for us.
Yeah, that was us too. We end up writing just tons of wrapper types, and every code gen type pretty much immediately gets thrown away. Like it's not useful because we have to, you know, null check every field.
We interestingly have kind of the same, but like also a competing goal, which is we want to be able to balance always maintaining data with the good developer experience. Like we expect, so like I'm operating on financial data. You really don't want to end up in a situation where like you throw out queried financial data if you're able to deal with a partial response. So we're even considering like crazy stuff, like having dual schemas, one of which has non-nulls in the right places, and one of which that like is basically copies it over but strips all the non-nulls out, so that if you wanted to query something, and like basically that way your default behavior is something that allowed you like safe, you know, dotting in and not having to deal with nulls until the case that you do. And so in that case, it's like less about the exclamation point operator being value addition. It's more about the question mark operator being value addition, and saying, hey, something below this could break, but if it does, like, please don't ruin anything outside of this space. Like, I want to create a boundary here. And like that's actually, and it's part of the reason why when the proposal came up, I was like, we were already having this conversation on one of my teams. I should flag that like the error boundary case is actually going to be really compelling to us. So that's actually the thing that our team will care the most about. But that's good. That gives us like a broad set already of things that we'll want to maintain, like both making sure that we don't blow up stuff we don't want to blow up. Like if a client cares about a partial response, then they should be able to describe that. Right now they can't. And if a client does not care about null values and wants to just like hammer in through some data, right now they can't describe that intent, and they want to be able to describe that too. So we've got kind of both sides of the coin.
Cool.
We went well over our 10 minutes, but I think that was actually a super helpful discussion. I feel like I learned something about this proposal.
Can I sneak in one last question?
Please
Sorry,
do.
I don't mean to cut into your and Benji's review time. I think we've kind of eaten it
No
all
worries.
on you. Alex, list elements, is that, is the plan still to kind of move ahead with these spec changes without considering list elements, or are you still waiting for more feedback there?
We have something written down in the doc I shared that we could use, like it's some possible syntax.
I saw that, yeah.
Talking to Netflix and Relay, it seems like they haven't run into any problems yet with this. Like it's not something that's been needed so far. We can add it, but you know, this was just me erring on the side of like doing nothing.
Okay. Okay. So unless there's, oh, sorry.
I was just going to say that from the Relay perspective, one asterisk on our, like the fact that we haven't encountered a need for this is that because we do have the throw semantic, the need to be able to create a contiguous chain of these is like removed. Whereas I can imagine if it is simply bubble, you would often want to be constructing a very careful chain where every single item in the whole chain leading up to a certain point is non-nullable. And maybe we sort of sidestepped that by having the throw semantic. So that's just an asterisk on the signal that we're giving about how we haven't found the need for that behavior.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense.
Yeah, I mean, if you know, if you or Apollo has like a good use case or a strong need for it, still open to doing it.
Yeah, I think there's going to be some information coming on that for sure shortly. It'll probably be on the PR as feedback, but yes. Okay, perfect. That's great to know. Thanks.
For Netflix also, it'd be a soft signal on that because it's mainly having this exist is a lot better than nothing. And so that doesn't mean it's perfect.
Gotcha.
As is.
Awesome.
It could also be that should we decide not to have something that would support digging into lists, that it still ends up being valuable to explore potential syntax for them so that whatever it is that we do end up agreeing on doesn't like explicitly block our ability to go describe that in the future. So if we find out that like, oh, exclamation point and question mark alone, I don't know, that maybe that's like ambiguous with regard to lists, then we'll want to resolve that. But hopefully it means like we don't have to decide like definitionally we will or won't support lists. Like another option is defer that conversation until a later proposal to like extend this behavior to go into lists in the future. It'd be better if we answered it upfront, but preserving that seems good.
Yeah, definitely want an upgrade path. Sweet. What needs to happen before I reach stage 2 on this? What's left to do?
Stage 2. So stage 2 implies, what did I have for stage 2?
Apologies. I'm doing this for work, so I got like milestones and deadlines and estimates and stuff.
That's awesome.
Totally understandable. So I think like I would consider stage 2 the point where we can like actually start doing stuff with real prototypes. Like you've got code landed in a PR, code landed in one of the implementations of a code generator. That's like not explicitly required for stage 2, but I'd say like that would set you up very, very strongly. I'm seeing if I can't pull up my, is it participation guidelines or is it something else? I've got it written down somewhere where we actually do have rules or guidelines that help us describe each stage. It's not great that I have forgotten what they are. Here we go. Stage 2 draft. This consensus that the solution is broadly preferred. So I think actually we are pretty close to that one. It's like, hey, is this the idea that doing this via syntax and the location that you have, roughly the behavior that we're describing, like that's the one that we generally all agree is the right one to have. That we've resolved all of our identified concerns and challenges. That one, it seems like we don't have. Like we've identified them. I don't know that we've resolved them yet.
Yeah,
that we've precisely described everything with spec. Like basically, like the spec might not have all of the edits applied, but like broad strokes, everything that needs to be in is in. And then pull requests are at least in the right places, if not merged. And then the difference between that and being accepted is that like review passes have gone over everything, and we've made sure that like not only is description in the spec there, but like all the non-normative notes are good. Like everything is like, you know, spit polish is basically the difference between 2 and 3.
Okay, excellent. Thank you very much.
Sweet. Very, very valuable conversation. Thank you for helping us lead that, Alex. And thanks for your work so far on this. You've made a lot of progress. So great work.
Of course. Thank you.
Cool. So we should probably acknowledge that we did the October 2021 spec cut.
Yeah, I didn't have it on the agenda because I got no real action to ask from this group, but sorry for it being so late, but hey, celebrate. That is out there. I wrote a blog post about some of the backstory behind it that talked a little bit about why the GraphQL Foundation exists in the first place and how that made this slightly more challenging of a release than before. Huge shout out to Brian. I don't know if everybody here has gotten a chance to meet Brian.
Yeah.
Brian had to go through the change log of not just the changes that were made in the last couple of years, but literally every change that's ever been made to the GraphQL spec, and make sure that the author of that agrees to our like new distribution rules, which like seems like maybe a painful exercise, but like the reason for that is very important, because presumably anyone could show up and be like, yeah, MIT is a thing, but like actually I'm not okay with company I don't like X using my work, and I'm gonna like sue them now. And this is actually seems theoretical, but it's actually like a huge reason why we created the foundation in the first place, is like allowing any one company or individual the ability to like jump in and say, I revoke the thing that I contributed, is like hugely painful. Luckily, everyone here I know is well-intentioned, but there are other open source foundations in which that is not the case, and you get like big companies that fight with each other. There's unfortunately legal precedent behind all these things. So Brian did like a huge amount of legwork to do that, and that's a big part of the reason why it took so long, is getting to the point where the Linux Foundation's legal team also backed him up and like got to the point where they were like felt very confident that we were in a good legal standing to cut it. So when we say that this is the first cut that's under all the guidelines of the GraphQL Foundation, like that actually has heavy weight to it. There's like all of the like actual legal text that we've written is now enforceable and solid. So that I'm super excited about. You know, lots of really great technical work went into that draft as well. Although I feel like since then we've already done a considerable amount of pretty high quality work. So hopefully going forward, this will be a slightly less dramatic and regular annual process. But yeah, celebrate. If y'all want to write any blog posts about it, please feel free. Talk about it at conferences, definitely do that. Let me know if you want my help with reviewing any content if you ever end up doing anything like that. But yeah, it's out.
Congratulations all. It's awesome.
Okay, with that, we'll wrap up the meeting. Benji and I only have a few minutes left, but still some time rather than others. So I'll stick around for anybody who wants to quickly go through some actions. But thank you all for joining. This has been very helpful, and see you all at the next one.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks again, Alex.
Take care, all. Thank you.
You can probably turn the recording off at this point, Lee.